Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion about World War I. Well, actually, this is going to be our final discussion about World War I. So the big thing that we actually need to understand is we're now going to be wrapping up World War I. We're going to go ahead and talk about this conflict and then move on from it. Start getting into the Roaring Twenties, the interwar years leading up into World War II. Then we'll have our crash course on unit number 9. And then you'll be taking your AP test. So a big thing to be keeping in the back of your mind is if you haven't at this point, you definitely should already be studying your old content for the AP test, right? Go ahead and track down Elizabeth Hamilton, get that Quizlet that's got all the warm-ups on it. Go ahead and talk to anybody and everybody, find whatever you need, get some key terms, watch some Heimler videos, do what you got to do, and just get ready and prepped for that test that's coming up in a few weeks, right? But the big thing is let's not dawdle too much, and let's go ahead and wrap up World War I, and let's go ahead and get into our discussion about the end of this conflict. Now, there's one area particularly of this war that we haven't talked about. So we talked about the Western Front, we talked about the Eastern Front, we talked about the Russian Revolution that started in 1917. And then we also kept going in Russia, right? Now, there's a big thing you need to understand really quickly when you're thinking about it in the back of your mind. The Russian Revolution, okay, actually took place from about 1918/19 to about 1921/22, right? So the stuff we're about to be talking about actually happened before the Russian Civil War ever broke out. Before the Reds and the Whites were actually fighting one another, we're now going to kind of jump back in time just a little bit and talk about what was going on in the East and then talk about how the war was beginning to end out in the West, right? You got to kind of have to do that. Whenever you talk about Russia, you got to go ahead and talk about their civil war and stuff like that before you go any further. But don't let it confuse you too much. But let's go ahead and talk about what's going on in the East, right? So something that we need to understand completely is that the Allies and the Allied powers are beginning to increase in efficiency, right? And what I mean by that is that the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, and, well, not Russia, because they're out, right? Russia's basically out because the second the revolution started, they stopped fighting anyway. But Great Britain and France, and now Italy as well, are beginning to increase their efficiency when it actually comes to fighting this war. They're beginning to open up new fronts and try to figure out other ways to take other major players out of the war. One particular group of people that they want to take out are the Ottomans, right? So we do have actually a Middle Eastern theater of this war as well. Now, a lot of people and a lot of historians, whenever they're talking about the Middle Eastern theater, typically like to talk about things like the Battle of the Dardanelles, the Gallipoli campaign, the Battle of Jutland and stuff like that, which are a few key battles that do discuss the Allies' first and earliest attempt in the early 1900s, or excuse me, not in the early 1900s, in the early phase of the war in like 1914, 1915, 1916, trying to attack Ottoman Empire like territories through the Strait of the Dardanelles and trying to take away their Black Sea access routes, right? But then the British are going to come up with a phenomenally intense idea on a way to actually encourage the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire and its final death stroke, right? And what we're talking about here is Arab revolts, right? So what they actually encouraged to happen under the leadership of this guy right here, his name is Sir Lawrence of Arabia. Sir Lawrence of Arabia led a British battalion to actually go out and recruit these men, right? These are Arabs that actually lived in the territories controlled by the Ottoman Empire, right? These are people that lived in modern-day Syria, upper areas of Saudi Arabia, also Palestinians and things like that, right? He went over there and recruited them and said, look, y'all have never really enjoyed living under the Ottomans. Like, those are the Ottoman Turks, and the Ottoman Turks may share your religion, but they don't even worship it in the same way as you do, and you also don't get along with them. So he actually encouraged their revolts, right? Encouraged revolts to destabilize the Ottoman Empire and kind of pretty much take them out of the war altogether. Now, a crazy thing is going to happen during this progression of the war, though, and the Ottoman Empire is going to be fighting internal revolts going on in their entire area. They're also, though, going to be very, very nervous about a group of people known as the Armenians, right? Now, just to give you a heads up of who the Armenians are, this right here is Armenia, or the Republic of Armenia, which is right close to Azerbaijan, Georgia, and right here in Russia. Now, the Ottomans were losing many of their battles to the Russians in this general area, and so they actually blamed the Armenians for their losses and claimed that they were aiding Russian troops in their ability to fight and then also fighting alongside of them, leading to this event known as the Armenian Genocide from 1915 to 1917, where the Ottomans forcibly removed over 800,000 people from their lands in Armenia so that they could use it to create military defense fronts against the Russians and then also steal their land from them. This led to a massive genocidal campaign that caused starvation and also executions by the Ottoman Empire and by the Ottomans against the Armenians. And as we can see, it claimed the lives of over 800,000 people as they were actually blamed for aiding the Russians during this entire war and during the progress of these events. And this right here is actually one of the monuments that's actually dedicated to the Armenian genocide in modern-day Armenia. But that is what's going on in our Middle Eastern theater, right? Our Middle Eastern theater has these revolts actually being organized by Sir Lawrence of Arabia and the Brits, and then we also have this very important event known as the Armenian genocide that to this day, the Turkish government has still never once acknowledged and also still never apologized for, which is absolutely insane. Now, going back over to the Western Front, though, like when we jump back over to the Western Front in Europe, what's going on? That front that spans all the way from the North Sea, all the way past Belgium, all the way down to the Republic of Switzerland, 440 miles of contiguous trench. Meanwhile, what's going on over there? So when the Russian Revolution begins, right, you have to understand that this picture right here is a picture from the Battle of Passchendaele. As you can see, these soldiers are on their last steam. They don't have much left in the tank. They've got little gas left in the tank and little petroleum reserves left at all. People are running out of supplies. The Brits are considering melting down frying pans at this point to try and make bullets out of them, right? They are really struggling, and this war is at an all-time bad part of the stalemate, right? You have to understand as well, though, that Germany, all out of nowhere in 1917, when the Russian Revolution begins, is going to attempt to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Why now? Why would they do this now? Why would this picture right here relate to this unrestricted submarine warfare? Well, you have to understand this is Germany's final push, right? Germany is trying to actually figure out a way to swipe a blow at the Brits and the French to get them to surrender before the Americans ultimately actually end up getting involved in the war. Now, why now? You got several reasons why now. Lenin is successfully back in Russia, so the Russians aren't going to be able to stop you when you start this back up again. Food riots and low morale are also at an all-time high in Germany, right? Food riots and hunger riots are breaking out all over Germany. You saw that on your test, right, where the butcher shop was being destroyed by German residents and German people because of the blockades in the North Sea, preventing the importation of goods. And then also you've got the Western Front in the West and the Eastern Front in the East, preventing goods from coming in from either side as well. So they're running out of food and they're running out of supplies, right? So they're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare to, again, try to, strike a death blow. Rationing is becoming very ineffective. They are drafting, soldiers, in Germany as low as the age of 15 because they're beginning to run out of soldiers. And they're expecting to try to make a very final push, right? So as you can see right here, this is the picture that was from your test. The food riots are getting out of hand. They don't have much left in the tank. They need to figure out to do something. And then all of a sudden, in 1917, April of 1917, actually, I believe, or was it March? Was it March or was it April? What day was it? Let's look it up real quick. Telegram. A note is going to be sent. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy and controversy around this note, but it was actually sent in January of 1917, about a month before they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. So in January of 1917, word on the street is that a note got sent from Germany to another country in the world, convincing them to attack the United States, right? And apparently it was sent by a German ambassador by the name of Arthur Zimmerman, right? So now look, the big thing about it is all this stuff coupled with the Zimmerman telegram is why the Germans reconvened unrestricted submarine warfare. Well, let's talk about the Zimmerman note real quick, okay? First of all, is there some controversy surrounding this note? Yes, there's a lot of controversy surrounding this note. There's a lot of controversy surrounding this telegram because it seems so farcical, the things that were actually written in it, and it also seems so ridiculous that the Germans would ever even try to give this an attempt. But the main controversy that surrounds this telegram is that some people believe in the past that it was actually faked by the British to try and get the Americans involved in the war, and a lot of other different things. And some people actually believe that the American government actually tried to use it as a way just to garner support for the war back in America, right? But as you can tell, like I said, there's a lot of controversy that surrounds it. And also the other big question was American involvement inevitable, right? Were we going to come into this war regardless of the Zimmerman telegram? We don't really know, and history can't really tell you that. But we do know that ever since the sinking of the Lusitania, the biggest thing that we said was Germany, do not reconvene submarine, or do not start using unrestricted submarine warfare again, or we will get involved in this war. And so it seems kind of oddly convenient for the Germans that they start a month after this telegram gets discovered, right? Because they're like, oh, well, here they come anyway. So going into it, let's talk about what it it said, let's talk about when it was sent, right? So it was written by a man by the name of Arthur Zimmerman, who is a German ambassador. And it was written to the German minister to Mexico. So just to give you a heads up, ambassadors have offices all over the world, right? And there are ambassadors for each country back to their home country, right? For example, if I wanted to go off and be the ambassador to Germany for America, I would then move to Germany, and then literally like the ambassadors from the United States would then communicate with me while I was in Germany, right? So this is kind of that situation. Arthur Zimmerman sent a telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico, right? Sent it to him on January 1st, 1917, and apparently was intercepted by the Brits, right? It was a telegram, so it was going through like actually telegraph lines, and what it actually apparently said was it was trying to convince Mexico to invade the United States to prevent them from actually going into Europe and stopping the Germans' last push to try and end the war, right? The way the German government apparently thought about it was that if the Americans are busy fighting Mexico, then they actually won't be able to stop us, right? So literally the German government was apparently trying to convince Mexico to invade so they could get back certain lands. And the Germans said, we will give you back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if you do this successfully, right? Then what's going to happen is once it's intercepted by the Brits and it's given to the American government, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States at the time, is going to do something very intense, and he's going to publish it in American newspapers in March, right? And then U.S. is going to declare war in April, and here come the doughboys, right? So now look, so yes, the doughboys, right? That is actually a slang term used to refer to American soldiers because following the publishing of this note in American newspapers, fervor for this war exploded, right? It actually exploded, and the American men were like, oh no, we're going, and we're gonna go in with a head full of steam, right? So the thing about it though is the doughboys is actually what was the slang term that the European soldiers used to refer to American soldiers that are now coming into this war due to the fact that the Zimmerman telegram has now actually convinced the Zimmerman telegram and unrestricted submarine warfare has now convinced the American government to get involved, right? So those are your doughboys right there. But I think it's also really, really important to notice something key about this picture, and that's the fact that it is the early 1900s. So all of the American fighting units were actually completely white, right? So now look, but they are not the only groups of Americans that actually fought. This group of young men actually went and fought for the French from the United States. And they have one of the sickest names I've ever heard of in my entire life. They're called the Harlem Hellfighters, right? And they actually left, went to France, joined up with French militia corporals, and actually began to fight for the Allies completely on the as Americans because they wanted to go off and fight for their country, right? And so actually really, really quick, we'll talk about them a little bit in class as well, but the Harlem Hellfighters are a really, really cool story, right? So going into it though as well, you have to understand though it takes time to mobilize, right? It takes a little bit of time to get the Harlem Hellfighters ready to go over and fight in this war. It takes a little bit of time for Americans to go through basic training, to train their men, to get supplies ready to go. So what are the Germans going to do in the meantime? They're going to go on the offensive, right? And there's a massive German summer offensive that actually goes down towards right before the Americans actually arrive back in this war. They use a plethora of different tactics to try to attack the Western Front trench lines and try to get to Paris as fast as they possibly can, right? They want to get there before the Americans arrive. They use stormtroopers, they use heavily armored vehicles, they use all these different types of poisonous gases and all these new different types of military tech, and they dramatically and intensely attack the Western Front trench lines as hard as they can. And actually, if you look at all this shaded area right here, that is everything that they actually gained in these attacks. So they actually managed to push the trench lines way, way back into France. And look how close they got to Paris, right? Look how close the Germans got to Paris. But the offensive eventually failed, and the Americans got pushed back, right? And once the Americans arrive, they start by literally midway through the summer of the German offensive failing, they start pouring hundreds of thousands of soldiers by the day into Europe and flooding them into Europe and then pushing all this stuff all the way back, right? And so as the fronts were slowly pushed back into Germany, everything also back in German cities, back in the country of Germany, is going to begin to crumble, right? So as you can tell, German men and women back in the cities, regular people, started rebelling against their own government and demanding an end to the war, and even the military began to beg and plead for the war to be over. And so literally a small revolution ensued in Germany and in Austria-Hungary. The German government just feels that they can't actually stop the German people from actually attacking their own institutions. This picture right here is actually German people, regular German people, in the streets of Berlin attacking a military unit of their own coming down the street to stop them. Look what they've built, y'all. It's a barricade. And they built it out of newspapers from a local newspaper nearby, right? And that right there is a defecting German soldier who's fighting alongside a man in regular clothing, right? So German regular people are fighting against their own government, demanding an end to this war, and because they need to feed their families. And this right here is actually the Kiel Mutiny. That right there is a Navy unit that actually refused to fight anymore. And they were like, look, we're not casting off. We're not going anywhere. This war needs to be over. My family is starving back in Munich. We need to call this off, right? So that right there is an entire German vessel that refused to go anywhere, right? Because of all the craziness that's going on, Kaiser Wilhelm is going to abdicate the throne and flee to the Netherlands, and the Weimar Republic would be founded, right? Austria-Hungary is going to abolish their monarchy completely after Franz Joseph dies, and so leading into November 9th and 10th, that all goes down, and then so what's going to happen is the Central Powers is going to surrender on November the 11th, 1918. And there's a very famous way to actually say this, is that on the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month in 1918, World War I would end, right? So we'll talk about the peace settlements and stuff like that that actually went down in class tomorrow. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.